Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast, and in this episode we're going to talk about the F4U Corsair. First off, I'd like to apologize for this taking so long to get published and out to you. A lot of things happened. I got sick, I lost my voice for about 8 days, and then we had a 24-hour live stream one weekend, so just kind of life and other events got in the way. We finally got this out now. I want to thank everybody who sent in F4U Corsair replays to help fill in the background footage. For the next video, or for the next episode, I'm going to do a A6M 0 video, and if you want to send in your A6M2, A6M3, A6M5 replays, that'd be awesome. That helps me so much. That helps get the video out faster. The more kills you get in the video, the better chance it is that I will be able to use it. So the Corsair, we're going to have to start out first talking about a gentleman named Chance Vought. I mean, he goes way back in aviation. He actually worked with the Wright Company as their chief engineer for a few years, and then he broke off and founded his own company in 1917. He eventually ended up dying in 1930. I've always heard the Vought company referred to in about a dozen different names, and we can almost do a podcast about just the Vought company evolution.
Yeah, Vought sold his company to a conglomerate called the United Aircraft Company. At the time, they owned Boeing, they owned Pratt & Whitney, they owned Hamilton Standard, the propeller company, they owned Sikorsky Aircraft, they owned Vought. They also owned Boeing's airline and their airmail subsidiary, which at the time was called Boeing Air Transport, which changed their name to United Airlines. In fact, to this day, United Airlines is still the same company. So let's see, United is still around. They're a company called UTC now. They still own Pratt & Whitney, still own Hamilton Standard. Just a few years ago, actually I think it was last year, they sold off Sikorsky. They spun it off. But one of the first ones that they did spin off was Vought. Vought survived on its own as Vought Aircraft Company, and then it was bought out by a guy named, I think his name was Robert Ling or Charles Ling or something like that. It became Ling. He merged two other businesses together, Timco, which is another airplane company, to form LTV, Ling, Timco, Vought. That's when the A7 Corsair was built, was under LTV. Vought's still around today. They are a major subcontractor for Boeing. They make 787 parts, 777 parts, 767 parts. They make all sorts of parts from them. In fact, actually, Boeing's South Carolina facility, where they are setting up the second production line of the 787, was actually a Vought facility. Vought's headquartered in Dallas. They moved there after the war at the Navy's insistence, actually. Their facility there is the old North American hangar where North America built a lot of B-25s. The Navy didn't want Grumman and Vought together on the same part of Long Island in case something happened, so they actually paid for the move to Dallas.
So if we go back to World War II, there's two other planes that Vought's famous for besides the Corsair, and that's the Kingfisher and the Vindicator. And then they did the Corsair. So we'll start with the Corsair, since this is a Corsair podcast. Rex Beazle designed the Corsair in 1938. First flew in 1940. It was the heaviest shipborne fighter to that point. The prototype is far different than the Corsair that we know today. And I'll put up a picture of the prototype, and you can see it doesn't even look like a Corsair in a lot of ways.
No, not at all. It had two 30s in the cowl, I think.
Yeah, the prototype had a 50 and a 30 cal installed in the fuselage, and then it had a 50 in each wing as well. And kind of like the early P-40s, it had those two guns, and then it had guns on the wings, kind of odd configurations. When they got combat reports back from Europe, they realized they needed to move more guns and put them in the wing, and that just messed up everything with the Corsair design because it had fuel tanks there. And so they put, as you know, 350s in each wing. That moved the oil tank and the fuel tank basically in front of the cockpit, pushed the cockpit backwards, which led to visibility issues. It had synchronized landing gear to that point in the prototype, but from there they had to undo that because of the guns in the wings. And is there any other changes you want to mention?
The wings, no, not necessarily. The wings are that weird shape called an inverted gull, because the prop on the airplane at the time, the Corsair had the biggest prop ever made. It was 13 feet 1 inches in diameter. It was the hugest prop. So in order to not have really long, very terrible, very fragile landing gear, the guy that designed the Corsair was a freaking genius and basically took a gull wing and turned it upside down, put the landing gear in the lowest part of the wing. The Corsair has got a couple things with it. The Corsair was the first airplane that was spot welded. The wings were spot welded together. The skin was. It wasn't a traditional rivet over stringer construction. It was spot welded like a car is. The Corsair prototype was the first Navy airplane to reach 400 miles an hour. At the time, it was the heaviest airplane to land on a carrier. Like I said, it had the biggest prop ever made up until then. It was a very unique airplane. It was well ahead of its time, which led to a lot of problems and led to almost 4 years of development before it was actually useful.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the problems, but second, I want to address two things. I've heard of many different things over my time in War Thunder. People call it a gull wing for some reason, like G-O-A-L. It's like seagull, G-U-L-L, and because it looks like a seagull's wing, I assume that's where that name came from.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, if you actually look at a seagull has a bent up and then out wing called a gull wing.
And then if you want to see what a normal gull wing looks like, fly a Chika, that top wing, that's a non-inverted gull wing. That's
a gull wing. That's
so
correct.
when people say the Corsair has a gull wing, that's incorrect. So just a little terminology thing. You have to say inverted gull wing when you talk about the Corsair. You say gull wing when you're talking about the Chika. Make sense? The propeller Cobey mentioned was freaking massive on the plane. Compared to Japanese or most of the British or German designs, the prop was about third bigger than a normal aircraft at the time, normal fighter.
Something like that, yeah.
Massive prop. But yeah, so we get to the prototype, and then we get to the F4U-1, which rolled off the factory line around 1942. So really early aircraft in World War II standards. And this thing had so many issues. Well, I guess we'll get back to the U.S. in a minute, but the British adopted the Corsair very early. It was called Corsair 1s. Holy crap. They didn't have any alternative to this thing. The British were, I guess you'd say, a little bit behind in carrier aircraft. So they took the Corsair because they had no choice. The British carriers were not the finest aircraft carriers in the world. They had, I guess, a few nice ones, but a lot of them, some of them were converted, other things that they just made aircraft carriers, and they weren't the most spacious. And the first issue they ran into was when they folded the Corsair's wings, it hit the ceiling.
Yeah, in the hangar deck below the flight deck.
They ended up having to chop off about 8 inches off of each wing to make it cropped so it would fit into the aircraft carrier. Now, one of the early issues that the Corsair had was that it liked to bounce when it landed. Well, when the British cropped the wings to get to fit in the freaking hangar, they fixed the bouncing issue because it didn't have all that extra lift from those huge wings. Kind of an interesting side effect. There's other issues that the British had to overcome. First off was the terrible visibility. They raised the pilot's seat several inches. They gave it kind of a Malcolm Hood-inspired canopy to give it better visibility. One thing I'll pass this over to Cobey for is they had a different approach to landing than the Americans did. If you want to compare the American carrier landing to the British carrier landing.
Yeah, at the time, the American doctrine of landing on a carrier was the same doctrine as you'd land on land. You'd fly downwind, you'd turn left to base or right to base. Actually, it was most of the time left to base, and then you'd turn left to final. Well, the British, because the Corsair had such a long nose, couldn't see the carrier on base to final at all. So what they did is they developed this really interesting kind of counterclockwise arc. And basically what you would do is you would come over the top of the ship right at basically no altitude, and then just make a nice, gentle, sweeping left-hand half circle and land on the carrier. You can see videos on YouTube of it during World War II of especially Corsairs doing it. The reason why they did that is because the pilot could keep the carrier in view the entire time by just looking out his left window the entire time. It worked really well with the Corsair. They used it later on the Sky Raider, on a bunch of other airplanes. It kind of became the standard de facto way to land carriers or airplanes on carriers for a long time, up until like the Panther, just until the speeds got so good that they couldn't do that. But one of the many innovations that the British had with carriers, the British also, we should mention, developed the angled flight deck, the mirrored landing system, and a bunch of other things that are still in use today. Steam catapult. If it wasn't for the British, even though they had really shitty aircraft carriers, American carriers would be garbage today if it wasn't for the British. They were very, very, very innovative. They were pretty neat, pretty unique things.
And the British had a lot less carrier incidents with the early Corsairs than the U.S. did.
Yeah, substantially more.
Their fatality rate was much less than ours.
Yep.
One thing I want to mention real quickly that they never were able to overcome was the Corsair has this little issue, and even into Korea. If you come in too slow and you try to add the power back on, the R2800, the Pratt & Whitney, killed quite a few people. And there's so much, if you want to explain this, when you put on the power, there's so much torque that if you don't have the wings perfectly leveled, it'll actually twist the plane and then dump you into the ocean.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. The Skyraider has the same problem. The Bearcat has the same problem. Basically, if you just gun the throttle at a real low throttle setting, if you just gun it forward, the propeller pretty much stays put, and the airplane itself turns, and it'll do 180 degrees, sometimes 360 degrees, where it'll just turn around, and you're dead. Simple as that.
Yeah, you're going into the ocean. Corsairs were tricky to land. So you go back to the U.S. The U.S. had all these issues, and they actually did not clear the Corsair to operate on a carrier for the most part for 2 years, until the later models got all these issues hammered out. The changes, though, that the British made were almost instantly put into the production lines back at Vought, and you're going to hear something called the F4U1 and the F4U1A. The 1A designation is something that people use post-war to define the differences between the Dash 1 early and the Dash 1 late, because the Navy never did a different designation for it. Before we get into a bunch of variants, I need to take a second to explain something. We're going to skip quite a few variants, prototypes, and so on. The Corsair was constantly changed and updated, and they tried different things, and there's probably on paper 100 different variants of this freaking aircraft. And there's also sub-variants because they didn't change the designation. They made engine swaps, they did this, they did that, and they never changed the designation. So when you talk about Dash 1, there's actually probably, 2 or 3 different...
There's 4 different versions total, yeah.
Of the Dash 1 that should probably have their own designation. So it gets pretty confusing. We're going to try to simplify it by cutting out a lot of the extra fat, so you get a pretty clear picture of what Dash 1...
Well, let's talk about the Dash 1. The Dash 1 was the baseline airplane. It was the original airplane that had what was called at the time the birdcage canopy, because it looked like a birdcage. Metal framing all around it, kind of like the early P-51s did and the early 109s did, where, there's individual panels of glass. Later on, they made a blown canopy, like the P-51 and the P-47 later. That was one piece of plexiglass. Actually, I think it was 2 pieces of plexiglass that had dramatically reduced canopy framing for much better visibility. After that, they actually made a full-blown, just like the Mustang, one piece of plexiglass canopy that was on the late Dash 1As and on the Dash 4 and so on and so forth. What else did they change? They changed the engine on the 1A. They made all sorts of changes. Like he said, the 1A should really, honestly, probably be its own variant because there were so many changes involved. But they were all done on the fly, so there was never any kind of paperwork, production, contract stuff changed. The 1A also had provisions for a drop tank or a bomb on the center line. The Dash 1 did not. What else? The Corsairs were also made by Brewster, which made the Buffalo, and by Goodyear Aircraft, which made all sorts of airplanes for the Navy. The Goodyear airplanes are FG-1As or FG-1s. The Brewster airplanes, I believe, were FB-1s, if I'm not mistaken.
F3s, I thought they were called.
Was it? I don't remember which one it was. There were so many different designations of it. The Brewster airplanes were not nearly as good as the Goodyear airplanes and the Vought airplanes. Actually, most surviving Corsair warbirds today are actually Goodyear built airplanes, and there are no Brewster airplanes left. They were pretty shitty.
Yeah, they were subpar in quality, and Brewster eventually went bankrupt about midway through the war, I guess.
Yeah, there was lots of problems with Brewster. They kind of screwed up the Buffalo. They did a lot of cost cutting and a lot of under the table kind of money laundering and stuff like that with the Navy, and they got in a lot of trouble. And yeah, it was just a bad thing.
So, in War Thunder, we have the 1A USMC, which led to some confusion. Why is there 1A and a 1A USMC? There's a few differences between that. The 1A USMC was never a real designation. The early Corsairs were given to the Marines because the Navy couldn't use them because of the carrier issues. There was a variant that had...
It had no arresting hook. Yeah, typically the Marines took off the arresting hook because there was a need for it. Those hooks are cast steel. They're several hundred pounds apiece, so you can just get that much more gas, that much more ammo on the airplane. They also changed the tail wheel from a solid tail wheel that the Navy liked on carriers to a normal pneumatic, like a regular tire tail wheel as well.
So that's what the 1A USMC designation stands for. It didn't really need to be added to War Thunder, in my opinion, but that's what it is.
Yeah, in game, the original U.S. version of the Corsair, well, it's not the original U.S. version, but the closest thing to the original is the 1A USMC that's in the game.
Next variant of the Corsair is a huge jump in a lot of different ways. The F4U 1C and the 1D both came out basically side by side, or
Yep.
those two aircraft were developed side by side. The 1D was introduced before the 1C. Only 200 1Cs were built. That's the ones with the cannons that we know in game. It's primarily famous for its operations over Okinawa. It was supposed to be a ground attack variant, and the Navy ultimately kind of decided to stop at 200 because the M3 Brownings were starting to appear, and they realized that this is a better gun, it's more reliable. The cannons had infamous reliability issues, and they decided to move back towards the Brownings. The one thing that kind of baffled me was that the 1D has bombs and rockets that you can attach to its wings, while the 1C, which was supposed to be the ground attack variant, has no capability to put bombs or rockets on it.
Well, the 1C didn't have the rocket stubs. The 1D was the first one to have rocket stubs. Both could carry bombs on the center line, and I believe the 1D introduced the wing racks as well.
Right, but the 1C couldn't carry anything on its wing.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep. The only difference between the 1C and the 1A is the cannon armament. That's it.
What are the differences between the 1D and the 1A?
Lots of them. Let's see. There's more bomb racks. They put the zero-length rocket launchers on there, so they can have a true fighter bomber for close air support. There's a bunch of smaller differences. They put a different engine on there with water injection.
That was when the single-piece canopy was first used, too, I believe.
Well, on the on the late 1Ds it was. That's correct. Yes.
And then from those two aircraft, we go to the kind of, I guess you call it the Mac Daddy of the Corsairs, which is the Dash 4.
So let's talk about the Dash 2, and the Dash 3 in between. They were both kind of prototypes. The Dash 2 was a very early version of a night fighter that the Navy tried. It failed miserably. That's all you need to say about that. The Dash 3 was a early production Dash 1 that was fitted with a experimental supercharger that failed miserably. Won't need to talk about that.
All right, so then we get to Dash 4, which should have absolutely probably been added in game many patches ago.
Yes, yeah. What the Corsair should have been to begin with.
What the Navy wanted.
Yeah, exactly. It's got a 4-bladed prop on it, a bigger 14-foot propeller on it. It's got all sorts of different stuff. It's got a different cockpit. It's got the single-piece canopy.
Dual-stage supercharger.
Yeah, all sorts of good stuff. Water injection, all the stuff like that. It could fly at 450 miles an hour in level flight. It could climb at like 4,000 feet a minute and reach like 41,000 feet.
The Corsair was always fast. To put it in terms, the Corsair was, I guess you say, probably equal or a little bit slower than the P-47. It was much faster than the Hellcat was. And then you get to this model, and this thing was just an absolute speed demon.
Yep.
The Corsair, kind of go back a second, had terrible low-speed handling. That's why we had so many carrier issues. Yep. But when a Corsair's at 400 mph, it's happy. That heavy plane, wants to fly like a javelin through the sky. Those numbers are insane for a heavy aircraft like that.
Yep.
And that's the one that was operated by about late 44 to 45, so it kind of went from, I guess you call it early 1945 to the end of the war. Those aircraft operated.
There were some delivered before the end of the war in like June or July. I don't think they actually made it out to the Pacific before the war ended, but they were in full production.
And then there's two other variants that were being developed during World War II. The E and the N. Cobey, you want to talk about the N model F4U?
The F4U-4N was a night fighter version that the Navy was developing. At the time, we had a night fighter version of the Hellcat, which was actually an outstanding airplane. But the Navy was getting rid of the Hellcat and asked Vought to develop a night fighter version of the Corsair. The Dash 4N was the first one to do that. Only one was built, but it went into production later on as a much improved Dash 5N, which did phenomenal service in Korea.
So we're going to take a step back. This is so confusing, so I'm going to try and break this up. So that's kind of all the World War II Corsairs, right? So let's call that all 1942, 1945 variants of models. Hopefully that gives you a good picture of the 1A to the 1D to the Dash 4, right? There's some changes there. The Dash 4 is when things kind of really started happening for the Corsair. So during World War II, the Marines kind of get hand-me-downs from the Navy. And thankfully for the Marines, the Corsair was kind of a hand-me-down. The Navy couldn't use the Corsair, didn't necessarily want it. They chose the Hellcat for their carrier fighter. So the Marines happily took the Corsair, and it worked out pretty well. What would they have been flying if they didn't have the Corsair?
Probably Hellcats, yeah.
Marine aviation has a long history in the United States that goes back to famous squadrons in World War II. We don't want to focus too much on them. We could probably list off like 20 right here. There's still squadrons that exist today, like the Jolly Rogers. You've seen the Pirate Skulls in World War II. You'll see them on F-18s today. So one guy that I'm going to need to talk about, because I didn't talk about him in the AVG podcast, and a lot of people were like, why didn't you mention him? Let's real quickly talk about Pappy Boyington. I know Cobey doesn't necessarily particularly care for him. There's kind of a reason. I think Pappy Boyington's sometimes blown up bigger than he actually was. The guy has...
Oh, absolutely.
The guy has a very... You can make a movie out of this guy's life story, though. It's a very interesting story. I'd watch that movie. It's an individual who probably is fascinating because he has such a troubled life. And just to speak a little bit about it, he had marital issues, and then he drank a lot. He never really fit in well with the Navy. He got in a lot of trouble, a lot of controversy, just is what he did. Eventually, he went to AVG, which is where he kind of started becoming famous. He fought with those guys, and then the Navy eventually transferred him back from China to fly Corsairs. Then he became part of the famous Black Sheep Squadron, which had a TV show in the 70s, I believe. I remember seeing a few episodes of that as a kid. The cool part about Black Sheep Squadron was I believe they actually had real Corsairs on set, and they believe they did fly, correct, if I remember?
That's correct, yeah. They had 4 airplanes. They had, actually, if you watch it, they had a lot of Dash 4s on the show, and they had a couple Dash 5s as well. You can always tell by the four-bladed props and the chin scoops on the cowl. They also had a Zero, too. They also had the T6 Zero that was used in Tora Tora Tora. They used 2 of those.
So Black Sheep Squadron was famous in real life because they had about 200 kills in about 3 months' time. That's why they kind of hit the press and were famous at that moment. And then they had the TV show, which was 99.9% fictional. And that's why Pappy Boyington is kind of a household name for people who, I guess you call it in the 70s, 80s. People knew that name because of the TV show. Pappy Boyington, I believe he was dirt broke the rest of his life. Like, he was a name that most people associated with the Corsair. But I don't think he actually saw much of the money. Or anyway, the guy has had a very troubled life. But if it wasn't for the Navy and AVG, at least he could fly, right? Because that's about the only thing the guy had going for him.
Yeah, he was a very good pilot. He was a very, very, very good pilot, and that was probably pretty much about it.
Yeah, but you can make a movie. This guy's life was this drama from the time he started serving to probably the day he died. So, but if you want, there's plenty of books about him. I don't want, like I said, you can go on Amazon, type in his name, and I'm sure about 10 books will pop up. And the reason why I don't want to talk about it too much is because I guarantee you those 10 books you pick out and buy and read, you'll probably find huge differences in each book talking about him. This guy's, how many kills he had, where, did he do this? It's a very, I don't know, it's almost a myth at this point.
He was a legend in his own time, in his own mind.
All right, so back to his own mind. So back to the Corsair. Marines adopted the Corsair. It was a great fighter. It had, I believe, like 11-to-1 kill ratio. In the Pacific against other fighters, it flew against Zeros and Key 61s and Key 84s and M1Ks and all that stuff. It held its own against the best that Japan had. But the main thing the Corsair that you need to know about was it was a hell of a fighter bomber. That thing brought close air support to the Marines that I'm sure many Marines were thankful for. The Corsair kind of fit perfectly into the Marine battle plan. The Marines were storming beaches and trying to take over these islands, and the Corsairs brought in rockets, bombs, gunfire, eventually napalm, I believe, at the later parts of the war. There's actually stories of the Corsair, I believe it was Okinawa,
Yeah.
where the Corsair was basically taking off, dropping bombs, and then landing. Never get its landing gear up. It would just kind of take off, loft bomb, turn around, land, put another bomb on.
Right at the end of the runway.
I always like to think of the P-47 as one of the greatest ground attackers that the U.S. had for a fighter bomber role in World War II. The Corsair, it's probably safe to say the Corsair dropped far more bombs than the P-47s did. And the P-47s dropped a lot of bombs. The Corsairs brought so much munitions onto the Japanese, and as close as you want. The U.S. really never had anything else to do that job either. I mean, the Hellcats participated in that role too, but those were the only two planes we had. But because if it wasn't those, then would it be like a B-25 doing it?
Probably. Maybe the Army.
The Corsair was I hate to say this, but it was basically kind of like a brick. I mean,
Yep.
it was going to take a lot to take down this brick, but it would fly over. It had 6 guns, it had its rockets, it had its bombs, and it had a lot of survivability. Also, the Corsair had, you want to talk about this real quick, the life rafts in the wings, I believe?
Yeah, they were eventually taken out. The Navy had this stupid idea that the pilots were going to be able to ditch your airplane in the sea and then get the life raft out of the wing, and then fill it up and float away until it's something either a destroyer or a PBY came by to pick them up. But the problem is that oftentimes they would just go off in flight. It would tear the wing off. It would kill the crew. They'd like to fall out. They wouldn't inflate. They had all sorts of problems. They were taken out of most airplanes pretty darn quickly.
And there's also a little issue of them sometimes getting moisture and then just going off in the wing while you're flying.
Yep.
I remember hearing about that. Like I said, the Corsair, I wish I had like more stories. Like I said, I don't really know what else to say than it was a dump truck that dropped bombs on island after island after island.
It did work all throughout the war.
It worked really well for the Marines taking off of land-stripped air bases. The Marines didn't have to worry about most of the carrier issues that the Navy had to. The Corsair, though, did get cleared for carrier operations, I believe, the last few months of the war, kind of late war it did. So it did return to the Navy in 45.
It did, yeah. They finally got the landing issues figured out. They changed the landing gear. The internal structure of the landing gear, the oleo struts, were modified. They put a different tail wheel assembly on it that was much taller, so the pilots could see over the nose better. Had all sorts of problems, and the Navy finally rectified it. And then they cleared it for carrier service, and the rest is history.
So from there we get to the kind of the post-war years, and the Corsair was kept on after the war. The Hellcat saw its service and it was done. The Navy had the Bearcat, and then the Sky Raider was coming in online about that time. So I think that was the 3 main propeller aircraft the Navy were operating.
Yeah.
Was those 3 Bearcat, Corsair?
Most of the Corsairs went to the reserves pretty much immediately after the war, because the Bearcat was coming online, and the F4, the Phantom, the McConnell Phantom, the first jet fighter, was starting to come around too. So from 1946 until 1950, most Corsairs were either parked or flew with the reserves. In 1950, when the Korean War started, pretty much every Bearcat squadron was then reactivated with the Corsair, and the reserve lost most of their airplanes. They pulled a bunch of airplanes out of the desert, and the Navy started flying them again. It's really funny to see, like, if you look at some Navy squadrons, you'll see, like, pre-war, they flew the Wildcat, and then the Hellcat, and then the Corsair, and then the Bearcat, and then the Corsair again for 3 years, and then they went from the Corsair directly into the jets.
The reason why the Corsair was picked over the Bearcat, it was nothing against the Bearcat, but the Bearcat was not suited for the operations that had to be done in Korea. Like I said, the Bearcat was a high-performance aircraft. The Corsair was I guess you call it a bit better ground attacker than the Bearcat would ever be.
Yeah, because you can hang more shit off of it.
And then the performance, the Corsair was going to be flying at low altitudes and mountain regions, while the Bearcat was designed to kind of be more of a high-altitude interceptor. So the Bearcat was just not designed for that type of mission. Well, the Corsair did that all basically through World War II. So the Corsair, and I believe, did we still have more Corsairs and Bearcats too at that point, or?
Oh yeah, substantially more, several thousand more. Yeah.
That's why the Corsair was picked. There was nothing wrong with Bearcat. It just wasn't suited. It wasn't the best aircraft for that mission. And so real quick, we're going to talk about the Dash 4 saw service in Korea. There was another aircraft called the Dash 5.
Dash 5 was kind of the ultimate Corsair. The Dash 5 was the Navy's actual vision for the Corsair. It had cannons, It had it was the fastest Corsair. It had all sorts of stuff. It was really the best Corsair ever built. The Navy also bought a version called the 5N, which was a night fighter version that served really well in Korea for a long time, up until the 60s actually, in the reserves, up to like 62, 63. We gave the Dash 5 to the Honduras, to France, to El Salvador, all sorts of places. It had cannon armament. It also had metal control surfaces, and it also had automatic. Let me get this right. It had automatic cowl flaps, automatic intercooler flaps, automatic oil cooler flaps. It was the first one to have all that stuff. So all the pilot had to do was just push a throttle forward, and all the engine stuff was all taken care of for him. Zero-length rocket pods on it. You can carry 2 fuel tanks and all sorts of stuff. It was just a really good airplane. Huge, huge, huge airplane.
And then from there we had the F4U-6, also known as the AU-1, I believe.
Yeah, that's correct. The official designation was AU-1. It started out as the Dash 6, and it because it was such a different airplane, it became the AU-1. As it was a dedicated ground attack close air support version for the Marines. It had a single-stage supercharger on it. It had, I want to say, like 10 or 12 wing hardpoints on it. They were the same wing hardpoints that were on the Sky Raider. I want to say it's maybe 5 or 6 per wing, plus the 2 underneath. Four 20-millimeter cannons. It had all sorts of armor plating on it, like a ton of armor plating on it. The Marines use it exclusively. They were sent to the French after we got rid of them. The French liked them so much that they ended up talking to Vought and purchasing their own, which was the Dash 7 Corsair, which is the final version of the Corsair built. The F4U-7 is basically an AU-1 built with a different airplane, a different engine for the French, and that's it.
That was till 1952. The Corsair was in production from like 1942 to 1952.
Yep.
10 years in production for a World War II warbird. That's pretty impressive because none of its other competition was P-47s and Hellcats and all the other stuff. They're in production for 3 or 4 years and then closed down for the most part. The Corsair outlived them all, and even though it had such a troubled start, it became this beautiful machine in the end.
Finally, yes. It just took a long time to get there.
One variant we didn't mention that we need to probably step back to is the F4U, was it B? That was the one that shot down a MiG-15 over Korea.
Yeah, there was a couple hundred F4U-4s called F4U-4Bs that were cannon-armed F4U-4s. Basically, it's the exact same thing as the F4U-4, except it had 4 20-millimeter cannons in it. In 1951, a Navy pilot shot down a MiG-15 with it.
So I thought it was a Marine pilot. Anyway.
I don't remember.
Either way, it's still kind of a neat little note. So in Korea, the Corsairs, like I said, just did the same thing it did in World War II. It flew close air support. Kind of paint a picture of what the Corsairs saved the Marines' asses, 100% in Korea. And I guess I'll try to fill in the void here, a bit of like Korea history. The Marines pushed up past the 38th parallel into North Korea, or what's North Korea now. And we were just kind of, I guess you call it, pushing over the Koreans that we were fighting. And then the Chinese decided to join the fight, and they poured in by the hundreds of thousands. And the Marines that were up there were under-equipped, under-trained, and were outnumbered. And so a lot of them were set up on these hilltops or mountaintops, trying to defend themselves from just this onslaught of these Chinese, basically hordes that were swarming them and trying to overrun their lines. The Corsairs brought in close air support, trying to interrupt the Chinese troop formations and movements, anything they could. And also the Corsairs were also lifesavers because the Marines had no way of being resupplied. And so the Corsairs had these, I guess you call them little storage tanks, storage/drop tanks that they could put underneath their aircraft that they filled with ammo or other things that the Marines needed, medical supplies, clothes, and so they would drop those right on top of the mountaintop for the Marines to get to. So they were lifesavers in that way. One incident I heard about, I can't remember the book I was reading about, but there was Corsair, it was about this unit that got trapped on top of this mountaintop. They were surrounded by about 10,000 Chinese, and the Corsairs every morning and night would fly by and strafe and drop napalm and just, interrupt the Chinese as much as possible. The Chinese got pretty smart though quickly. Every time they heard the R-2800 coming over the mountaintop, they would all just lay down and disappear in the snow. And the Corsair pilots kind of quickly caught on that there's thousands of little footsteps, and then they all stop right here in the field. That's where I'm going to shoot. And so the Chinese hid behind rocks, and I almost want to compare it to the fighting that happened in Afghanistan the past decade. You know, just trying to dig out an enemy that's dug in the top of mountains. It's a absolute pain and a nightmare. There's one book that Cobey and I'm still reading through. I believe you finished it.
I've finished it a long time
by
ago.
Adam
It was a great
Makos.
book.
What was it?
Called Devotion.
Yeah, Devotion. It's written by the same guy who wrote A Higher Call. You want to tell a little bit about the book, the story?
Well, it's a pretty cool thing. This guy's name is Jesse. He was the first black pilot accepted by the Navy. Basically, he flew Corsairs in Korea. By the way, he was an ensign. He never got promoted, which is a shame. He actually had more flying experience than most of the guys in his squadron did at the time. Everyone said he was an outstanding pilot. He was just a natural, but the guy never got promoted past ensign. They were on a close air support mission, and he got shot down. And his wingman, who was his wingman for a long time, his name was Tom Hudner, I think, ended up basically crash landing his Corsair next to Jesse's so that he could get him out. And Jesse, in the meantime, passed away. He died from his wounds from the Chinese shooting up his airplane. Tom Hudner stayed there with him all night long, and Hudner ended up winning the Medal of Honor for what he did.
Really good book to read. It's
a fantastic book.
The gentleman who won the Medal of Honor was, and this is during a time of terrible race relations in the United States. The guy who went down for the African American pilot would be the last type of human being you would think. He was from a very rich white family.
Yep.
Who he was, I think, was Annapolis graduated. He was kind of a higher, I guess you call it 1% type, individual.
He was the top of the 1%. Absolutely, yeah. His dad was very well connected. He grew up very privileged life. Jesse, on the other hand, grew up the son of a sharecropper. They had dirt floors in their house. They didn't have electricity or running water when he was a kid.
It's a great story that you should probably pick up.
Is.
I believe the book's actually going for pretty cheap. It was just printed in huge masses, so you should be able to find it relatively easy. That's a recommendation from us. Other than that, I don't know. The Corsair, other famous things about Ted Williams, the baseball player, flew the Corsairs in World War II.
John Glenn flew Corsair a little bit, the astronaut, before he moved on to the Panther. Neil Armstrong, same thing.
So the Corsair has a very storied history. There's so much that we can never fit into a podcast like this. Hopefully this gives you some ideas, though, just kind of the evolution of the Corsair. And it was just basically a fighter turned ground attacker, extreme.
A great airplane. Once it finally got up to what the Navy wanted it to be from the get-go. Like I said, it took a long time because it was a very ambitious program. Once it finally got there, it was phenomenal. I just wish that War Thunder would do better and put the Dash 4 and the Dash 5 in the game.
There was 12,500 of these aircraft built, too, all total. Of course, that's over 100-something variants. There was a lot of prototypes, too, that I guess I should mention, or a lot of proposals. There was a counter-rotating propeller version that Vought tried to say, hey, Navy, we can do this. And the Navy was like, no. They also Vought came back with, hey, we can put field tanks in the wing, or we can do wingtip tanks like the Panther. And the Navy said, no, we have no interest in that. One thing we need to talk about, thankfully I remember this right before the end. One big difference between the Dash 4 and the Dash 1D was that the wing fuel tanks were removed for better maneuverability, but the Dash 4 had less range due to that. So that helped with a little bit of the low speed handling and stuff because the wings weren't so weighted. It's a very complex aircraft. I wish we could sit here. It'd probably be better if we did a PowerPoint presentation on this damn thing.
Yeah, it's true.
Hopefully you learned something. I encourage you to research it. There's not a lot of books out on the actual Corsair itself. Like I said, there's a ton of books on Pappy and on Korea and this and that, but there's not actually a lot of books that go through every nut and bolt on the Corsair. So we kind of skipped some information that we didn't feel was 100% validated because, yeah, I don't want to trust it. I mean, just with the 1B, Cobey and I found some vastly different things that people said about it. If you're cruising around the internet, please be careful when you're researching the Corsair because the misinformation on it is actually probably more than than a lot of other aircraft that I've seen.
Yeah, and that is 100% the Navy's fault, because the Navy was never satisfied with the Corsair. It kept on developing improvements over and over and over and over and over again. So it just kind of depends on the individual airplane that you're actually talking about. You could have two airplanes built side by side, same day, and have 20 different variations between the two airplanes. It was that weird.
Which I laugh because there was, what, two variants of the Hellcat? -3, -5?
Pretty much, yeah.
And then you have the Corsair, which there's, like I said, 120 or something. I don't know. I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Like I said, if you send in some A6, M2, 3, or 5 gameplay, I'll be extremely grateful. And I will get that podcast out sooner. I guarantee it. I have the actual research and the information compiled behind me, so it's like 80% there. So it shouldn't take me that long. And thanks for listening. If you have any Corsair questions, Cobey and I will do our best to answer them. Like I said, though, it's kind of a mangled mess. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.